All right, is that working out? Good? Okay. All right. First, I just want to say thank you to Amanda and to Naz and to the whole art department here at the U of O. My time in the sculpture program was just such incredibly important and transformational time for me. And I attended many visiting artist lectures in this room, so it is very surreal and terrifying to be here today talking with you all. So I'm going to start a little farther back than I usually do when I talk about my work, just because I am here at the U of O. I feel like I should show some of the work that I did here, if only to kind of show how the work you're making at any given point can sometimes be sort of a foundation for future work that may be different in ways that are unimaginable. For instance, for me, this is just one of the many kind of shocking and bizarre images that I've recently come across from my college archives while preparing for this talk. While I was here, I did zero woodworking, zero traditional craft mediums. In fact, I avoided them at all costs and did more sort of installation, performance, some video projects, and really just a lot of, that's the Laverne Krauss gallery before the nice new floors. A lot of just piles of, pink slime and debris scattered on the floor. Also a lot of wearable art, a lot of costumes. Really, I would just go absolutely nuts in my studio, staying up all night, just doing crazy photo shoots and rolling around in these piles of pink slime. And so here was my BFA thesis show. And so I was thinking, definitely a lot about ideas of the body and the natural landscape and kind of interactivity and materiality, but in ways that still sort of guide my work today, but just in completely different ways. And so, in the spirit of talking about how this kind of early work has translated to my current practice and kind of talking about that very difficult transition from art school where we are now to the real world, I wanted to show my first ever little collection of wood carvings that I made. So when I graduated, I started working at a furniture company, just making traditional dining tables, like an entry-level job, just sanding tabletops. And I started collecting scraps of wood and teaching myself to carve, sort of with the intention of making bowls and spoons that I could just sell at craft fairs. But immediately the work started taking on this very sculptural tone. And you can see even just from these two images, this sort of kind of even superficial formal connection between the two, just some of these ideas from art school finding their way into these small carvings, and kind of from the beginning there being this kind of tension between sculpture and craft and design and functionality. And so I continued with spoons and bowls and utensils, and these were sort of very much the starting point for my current practice. I was thinking a lot about the sort of inherent kind of unacknowledged intimacy that is in these everyday objects. Thinking about these sort of everyday objects that we clutch and we put them in our mouths to eat with, we use to serve each other, and we also use them to cut and pierce food. And I was kind of trying to draw out that almost uncomfortable intimacy from these objects by incorporating these very bodily biomorphic forms, but also in the way that I approached carving. I would carve in this very irregular sort of lumpy way, and then also just do this obsessive meticulous hand sanding where I would polish the wood to this point where it had this almost uncanny skin-like quality to it. And so I continued with sort of pushing what I thought of as the sort of anatomy of the spoon, thinking of the handle and the neck to where it would transition into the bowl, and the concave, the convex, the sort of upper sort of lip around the top rim of the bowl, and sort of continue just pushing and abstracting these different sort of design elements until the work would take on just an almost purely abstract sculptural form that I started to think of as these kind of like handheld sculptures, sort of, that still had this sort of mysterious connection to functionality in some way. Almost thinking of them like, rather than utensils for eating or serving, as like utensils for like the mind, like trying to, having this function of like picking at or uncovering sort of different sort of subconscious associations that we have. Almost thinking of them as like a Rorschach test where people would sort of draw their own sort of connections or associations in these collections. And so this is a more recent collection of carvings where I was thinking a lot about like seed pods and flowers and insects, but also still thinking about the body and tools, and trying to really combine all of these different references to create this sort of amalgamation of ideas and images for people to draw from. And also, stylistically, I would always kind of want this work to keep this very like beautiful, smooth, sensuous sort of texture that would draw you into the work, but then have these moments of almost like disturbing, grotesque details, or even sort of like funny, crass kind of moments that would just keep this experience of being like drawn into the work and then sort of like repulsed by what you find as the closer you look, and hoping that that was sort of an experience that would be reflected within the person interacting with this work, like kind of having that feeling of like, am I the only one noticing these strange forms that keep emerging? So yeah, and so here are a few more just examples from this most recent collection. Yeah, and then to kind of jump around a little bit back to those early days when I graduated and I was working in a furniture shop, just trying to make small little objects whenever I could after work. I started making these little vases. And again, these were meant to be sort of decorative, functional objects that could hold sticks or twigs or dried flowers. But then I immediately became sort of obsessed with them just as these like purely sculptural forms. Specifically really obsessed with this idea of just like the wooden blob with a hole in it. Just thinking of it as this thing that came from a place of like pure, utilitarian, functional design element, like the opening of a vase or a vessel. But when you look at that through the lens of sculpture, it takes on this much more like poetic and mysterious function, almost giving a kind of like inner life to these wooden objects, almost as if there's like a soul kind of like peering out from the wood or trying to draw you in. And also the way that this simple sculptural idea could just give the wood this feeling of like emotion or personality. And so it really just kind of spurned this kind of what feels like lifelong obsession with just finding and carving holes in pieces of wood. And again, I just emphasizing how it came from this place of like limitation, where I was just thinking about, vessels or vases in the opening. And in that space of like craft-based limitation, I sort of unlocked this whole sculptural language that has just really felt like this endless source of inspiration for me. So these holes, I also started incorporating them into these wall pieces that started off as bowls, and then just sort of grew and spread into these almost like landscapes or like topographic maps that had, valleys and craters, and gave this almost like geographical dimension to this kind of work. And then, yeah, interestingly, like, this idea that came from a place of like sort of, again, functionality and utility, the opening of a vase or a vessel, and then went to this purely sort of sculptural way of working, kind of made its way back to this sort of functional piece of furniture, a sort of semi-functional sculptural bench. And I was thinking again a lot about benches, the same way that I was thinking about spoons and bowls. They're this sort of intimacy and communalness to them, and that they're these pieces of furniture that sort of are designed to have multiple people sitting on them, multiple bodies, multiple butts having to kind of navigate one piece of wood. And so I kind of used that motif of the blob and the hole to sort of explore this, creating this kind of bizarre, lumpy log of maple wood that had these sort of disturbing little holes scattered across it, where the people interacting with this, sitting on it, you have to be very careful where you sit, where you put your hands. It can create a very like uncomfortable experience, but at the same time it has this like sense of humor to it. Feels like you could just get up and kind of like walk away. So it was kind of an important piece for me, just thinking about trying to pack this piece of furniture with so many like emotional and psychological associations, kind of trying to draw attention to how complex and layered furniture and everyday items are in our lives. So I think of this piece as part of like a larger group of work, a kind of ongoing body of work that is all based around and kind of grows out of this one technical process of bleaching wood and kind of sanding it with this really smooth and kind of like lumpy surface texture. And so with this kind of work, I'm trying to draw out this sort of like softness and sensitivity from wood, which has this, association as being this very like hard and sturdy, building material. But so for instance, with a piece like this, it's this huge boulder of maple wood that's all been laminated together into this solid mass, and it has this like weight and presence to it, but at the same time, the way the surface is treated, it has this very like soft, almost like squishy, vulnerable quality to it, which just is at odds with like what we think of as wood as this kind of weighty mass. Here's another more recent piece, kind of exploring the same ideas, trying to animate like a piece of wood with the kind of like lightness and movement and fluidity that I feel like is just this inherent part of wood as this living plant, but the way it's processed, industrially milled and all of that, it's kind of that element is really eliminated from the way that wood is present in our lives. And to take a closer look at that bleaching process, what's so amazing about it, for me at least, is that it, instead of like a whitewash or like a stain that actually conceals the grain, it's like a chemical reaction that actually like removes the pigment from the wood. So on one hand, it creates this like sense of material ambiguity and uncertainty, where you can't tell if this is like marble or like bone or ceramic, but at the same time, it actually like highlights some of the very like recognizable elements of wood, like cracks and knots and the grain. So it creates that space of like the familiarity and the unfamiliarity in a material that I feel is very important for the work. And I would incorporate that same sort of sense of like sensitivity and vulnerability that I was trying to achieve with the surface, also in the kind of formal designs of the works. These are some smaller pieces that have what I think of as these kind of like feelers, like insect feelers that almost look like they're just like stretched out of the wood. And then they have this pink dye on it that became a super important part of my whole practice, kind of adding these moments of warmth or sort of playfulness, and also continuing to create an even deeper sense of like uncertainty in what this material is. Two more examples of these kind of feeler type pieces. This piece on the left is just a stick that I had in my studio for years, and it was just that sort of transformational material processing of bleaching and sanding that I feel like gives it this poetic kind of like power and presence. Another recent two pieces that were just included in the show that I just had in Japan, sort of a ring and a ball, these kind of symbols of play that are kind of displayed on these solid masses of beautiful, expensive walnut wood that are just used as these lumpy, irregular pedestals. And that ring is constructed out of branches that I found that I joined together to make this kind of irregular, wonky ring. And you can't really see it there, but at the points where the sticks are joined together, I sort of try to conceal those joints with like epoxy and wood filler, and then carefully painted this pale pink to try to hide where those joints were. And the result is this sort of like pink splotches throughout the ring that are these sort of like embarrassed moments of like almost covering up a mistake or a seam, but also sort of draw attention to those points, almost like the ring is like blushing. A way I took that idea even farther is I started adding that pink maple glued up, and rather than trying to hide those seams, which is such kind of the regular way that is approached with woodworking, that pink dye actually like draws them out, and the dye sort of bleeds into the wood, creating this kind of like scarring in the wood. So yeah, I continue to just push this idea, so many different iterations. It's just definitely the way that I work, is to kind of keep experimenting and making, and trying to use the process of making as a way to discover new possibilities with one specific material or technique. And so maybe the most complex and kind of ambitious little collection of work that grew out of this specific process was this collection for a show that I had a few years ago that was called Home Life. And it was made, all the work was made during the pandemic. So, of course, it was this time of sort of intense introspection and isolation, and kind of a kind of more intense level of observation for our surroundings and the worlds that we live in, both on this kind of like domestic interior space level, thinking about the home, but also thinking about, the natural environment on an almost sort of ecological, cosmological level. So this show, incorporated references to like furniture and bowls, but also moons and trees and mountains, kind of sort of trying to draw them all together into one body of work. So another bench, this one's sort of an inverse of the whole bench, where it has this almost, again, topographical like mountain range or sort of series of kneecaps or elbows. Creates another kind of difficult seating experience. This piece was much more about just the idea of connection on this very like fundamental level, thinking of how like fraught and difficult human connection is in our kind of world that we live in, sort of expressed through these like contorted, swelling dowels connecting these two blobs in this almost like ladder or some sort of like constructed frame that has this kind of like emotional weight to it. This show, again, thinking about ideas of like nature flowing, forking paths of like a river or a bloodstream. And then another bowl that I carved sort of with the idea of like creating a bowl that was already full, and thinking of, sort of like the different permeations and sort of clustering of life in these like enclosed structures and spaces, and trying to pack ideas like that again into just the process of carving a wooden bowl. But maybe the central piece to this show is this piece called Tree. And it was this like 7-foot tall core of bleached maple wood, that out of it had sprouting like all of these different carved objects, different species of wood, different textures, different surface treatments. And it was very much about sort of that kind of like sort of like beautiful and resilient power of nature to create, you know, variety and new growth and new possibilities. But it also had this sort of sense of like this sort of like horror in the capacity that nature has for the new and the unfamiliar, you know, new strains, new, you know, kind of the unknown that exists in nature. And so kind of having that dynamic of the beauty and also this sort of like horror captured in this idea. Also, it has almost like a human presence in the space when you encounter it, so it almost feels like this reflection of our own capacity for these different, for like the new and the unfamiliar. And so if all this work has kind of been part of this specific body of work that is based around that bleached maple technique as this kind of core to it, I like to think of this other body of work that's also constantly evolving and in progress, that's based around this very different technical process of carving wood, hand-carved, creating this hand-carved texture with the black India ink stain. And so this kind of work, unlike so much of my work, which is based around sanding, so much sanding, this is all created with just super sharp carving gouges, around 10 or so, that I constantly sort of like rotate between to create this ever-changing, ever-fluctuating pattern of carved marks. And I think of it very much as this kind of like shadow body of work to the kind of pale, squishy blobs. And the process for me is super meditative and kind of trance-like almost, getting lost in this carving process without any sort of like kind of compositional design really within the carved space, just sort of allowing the mark making process to kind of create these different patterns and textures. And the main sort of shape that this work takes are these carved paintings, these wall pieces that for me, I like to think of them as sort of these almost like portals, kind of inviting the viewer into this sort of meditative space where they can get lost in that carved texture and sort of see whatever patterns or like kind of visions emerge from that sort of like intense depth of black texture. And the compositions for these are very like simple and kind of these archetypal shapes like ovals or triangles or vertical lines, kind of almost trying to create this like spiritual space of meditation or reflection. Also, three-dimensional forms that I make will take on this carved texture as if they're these physical shapes that emerge from that field of black texture. And again, thinking of them as these sort of shadow objects to those squishy pink blobs. So overall, this style of work is very different than a lot of my work. It kind of acts as this like quiet, again, meditative sort of like undercurrent that is always sort of like present with my work. And another way that carved texture, another shape that it takes, is with these tangles, these wooden tangles. This piece in particular is like a 6-foot long tangle created from eucalyptus branches that were carved and joined together to create this shape that was very much inspired by drawing. Thinking about the India ink that I was using, I think I was thinking a lot about like ink splatters and ink drawings, and also just trying to capture that really like kind of like wild and free energy that exists in like a scribble or like even scratching out a mistake, trying to like capture that in a three-dimensional object. And to do that, you know, I kind of relied, rather than on my own human like compositional decision making, looking to the natural world and finding these curves and lines in nature and like branches and sticks, and then sort of harnessing them into this three-dimensional shape that almost feels like a collaborative 3D drawing between my own sort of carving and my own hand and then like the natural world. And so I kept pushing this idea as well, and I started casting these sort of stick tangles in bronze to even more fully like solidify and permify these kind of wild, loose gestures. And these kept evolving, becoming maybe less based in like the graphic kind of linear composition and more trying to capture the sort of transformational, sort of deteriorating energy of nature in a kind of shiny, polished bronze form. Yeah, and then so while most of this work that I've been showing is pretty much centered in the world of kind of art and sculpture, I wanted to show how my work is constantly sort of weaving between these different sort of fields of craft and design and art. So while I was making some of those bronze tangle sculptures, I started imagining them sort of illuminated by candlelight, and it kind of evolved into this bronze candelabra, which then became these sort of bronze lamps and lighting fixtures, which for me was a very kind of difficult project, trying to reconcile some of my sculptural kind of tendencies with having to have like functional internal wiring and sockets and switches. It was definitely something. These are still kind of in progress. I'm still working through. But a more successful sort of version of this, bringing the kind of art and sculptural ideas into the world of design and craft, was a collaboration I did with a ceramicist at Heath Ceramics in San Francisco. We made a series of these ceramic canisters with hand-carved wooden lids. And I really loved this project and wanted to include it because it was this experience of taking what had become this very, as I was saying, kind of serious, mystical process of this black carved texture that, you know, was preserved for like gallery walls for the most part, take it and put it on something that could essentially become just like a cookie jar or something that you use every day and actually touch that texture, and it could get scratched up and sort of evolve over time as this actual useful object. But as I was making these, and again, just to show how my work is always sort of weaving between these different ways of thinking and making, I became sort of obsessed with that carved texture in this round, circular orientation, and started seeing these circles as these kind of like mapping of the night sky in this way. And I wanted to make like a huge one that I thought of as this big like celestial sky map. This is an embarrassing photo of me trying to look like a badass in my studio next to my huge sculpture, forgive that. But yeah, so that texture started to take on this sort of like depth and kind of like infinite quality of the night sky. And it actually inspired an entire show that was sort of thinking about these sort of more these ideas of like human connections with nature on like a astronomical, cosmological level. And so again, this whole show sort of evolved out of that sort of craft-based little mini mass production of those lids for that ceramic project. So again, just to show how the work can evolve from unexpected places. But so the kind of central work for that show was these stone carvings carved in this pink alabaster stone, which was a very like new and a very important experience for me working with that material. I was originally drawn to it because of the sort of like historical reference to like marble statues and busts from antiquity and the way that those would, you know, crumble and decompose or kind of decay over time. To create these sort of abstracted forms. And I was trying to capture that sort of feeling, but in these very smooth, biomorphic forms that almost look like they were growing into these kind of abstracted shapes. But really it was the experience of like just working this material and polishing it and kind of like revealing this absolutely insane surface quality from the stone that really just blew my mind. And it was like, at some points showing this psychedelic, beautiful patterns, and then at other moments it would have this almost like grotesque feeling of like a slab of raw meat or like muscle tissue in this very like disturbing, visceral way. At other times it would have this like kind of celestial, almost like cosmic patterning of like galaxies or, you know, gas storms on Jupiter. So I was just totally blown away by the capacity for this natural material to have so many kind of undeniable and inexplicable visual associations. And also just this experience of working, you know, with my hands, like sanding and polishing this material that was this like ancient geological like formation that was like millennia old, forged in the earth, and I was making these little like pink funny blobs out of it. It was just a very like eye-opening experience and kind of got me thinking about material in a very different way than I had before. So I did incorporate it into some of my wood pieces as this kind of like material that would bridge that mysterious sort of interior space of the wood with the external space. But really, most importantly, it kind of shifted how I approached working with wood as a material. So that on the left is the polished stone, and then this is just the highly processed maple wood that I had worked. And you can see this sort of like kind of strange similarity emerge. And so, yeah, it kind of had me thinking more about wood as a material, not like just a raw material that I could kind of impose my designs and ideas on, but as this material that has this like history of growth and decay and like transformation, and kind of just, yeah, it created this new level of like observation and almost like venerance for this material, and to think of it more as like a starting point for sculpture rather than just like a material to shape something out of. And so, yeah, this body of work kind of most clearly captures that new way of thinking about wood. When I made this, I was spending a lot of time in our kind of like soggy Oregon forests, thinking a lot about like decomposition and decay and you know, regrowth and regeneration and the kind of wild transformative power of nature. And so I tried to capture that with this work. And I did it all. All this work came out of one fallen maple tree that I found on a neighbor's property. And I collected it all and just started working it in this way where I was really just removing all the rotten wood, which was the majority of it, this sort of like spongy, wet, rotten wood, until I was able to find these strange forms that were like the only solid wood remaining. And I kind of used those forms as the sort of guide for these shapes. And the result, yeah, were these wild forms that were very different than a lot of the work I'd made in the past. And many of them were these very like thin, flaky sort of outer shells, because that was all that was left in most of this tree. And they also had this very like contorted, sort of almost again grotesque form that was just, you know, clearly inspired by, again, the like decay or the traumatic moments in this tree's life and its sort of desperate attempts to like regrow and reform itself over time. This piece, for instance, was like a cross section of the tree showing just how much of the interior of that tree had rotten away over time, and how the decay and the fungus had actually like eaten away at the wood along the points where it had been cracking. And as I kind of removed all that rotten wood, I was left with this billowy sort of like pleated surface in the wood. And this one, again, is just like a great example of the like pure sculptural intensity that can exist in the natural processes of decay and regrowth. A piece like this, I feel like most of the sculpting was done by the tree itself and by the natural processes that occurred, and I just kind of cleaned it up and polished it, and then, yeah, treated the surface in a way that was also new to me. Like I'd always bleached wood and always used pink, but the way that this particular tree with so much like rot and decay and fungus in it, it reacted to the bleach in these really unexpected ways, creating all these like yellow and green and purple smears that I really embraced. And I started using like watercolors and paints in a way that I had never done before, trying to think of it as this kind of like canvas. And so yeah, there'd be these like quiet moments that almost looked like sculpted marble fabric or wrinkles of flesh, and then these moments of like explosive, kind of like psychedelic color and grain. And again, I found a bowl as I was sort of like kind of exploring this tree and all the insides and outsides of it. I found the point where like a burl had completely rotted out and detached itself and formed this like natural bowl. All right, and so for the final piece or the final project I'm going to talk about is by far the biggest project I've ever done, and it all kind of grew out of, again, these smaller pieces that kind of harken back to my sort of first carvings and the way that I sort of began to work. I made a collection like this that I showed at an art fair a few years ago, and a curator who was selecting artwork for a big public plaza that was being built, he saw my work and kind of invited me to propose work like this on a huge scale cast in bronze. And so after 3 years of this kind of insane process, the work actually did grow to this huge form. This is some examples of it while it was still in progress at the foundry. But yeah, just to quickly kind of go through the process of making this work, it started with me creating these small scale carvings, and then I worked with a foundry or a company in Portland to create these 3D models of these carvings that we digitally enlarged to their full scale, and then actually like digitally split up the kind of outer surface shell of these models and 3D printed those sections in in this sort of like synthetic wax-like material that was then cast in bronze, those different parts welded together to create these different forms, and then sort of worked to try to capture that kind of hand-sculpted, hand-carved quality that my work has. And it was a lot of sanding, a lot of polishing, until ultimately we created these sort of satiny, semi-reflective surface. And that's it with all the burly kind of foundry dudes posing in front of it. Yeah, and the installation process was extremely stressful and intense, having these huge bronze, slippery, smooth objects like hovering above of this freshly built plaza with these glass skyscrapers everywhere, and everybody just looking to me for like direction. It was like a terrifying experience, but somehow, some way, it all got placed, and just as of a few months ago, the plaza is now open, and so it's been this really wild experience to see my work being interacted with on such a huge scale. You know, my work has always had this sort of like tactile, you know, handheld quality to it, but to see people climbing on it and sitting on it has just been totally mind-blowing. And yeah, now it's sort of been a process of now watching the patina and kind of monitoring how it's changing over time. They were done in a way that was just sort of natural bronze waxed, so they're sort of evolving and changing and darkening, and they will kind of continue to evolve, eventually becoming green and brown, sort of taking on this kind of patina of the natural environment and also of the kind of community, with every like fingerprint and handprint kind of continuing to change the surfaces. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you all. Oh, it's in Bellevue, Washington. Sorry, I meant to say that. Yeah, yeah, right outside of Seattle. Yeah, definitely check it out. I haven't been there since it was installed, so I'm very eager to hear updates if anybody goes up there. Yeah.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Because you have extraordinary work.
Thank you.
I'm a professor of art.
Thanks.
I am still trying to make that transition hot when you were here. For 4 years, it sounds like you wouldn't be caught dead doing any kind of sculpture.
Yeah.
What were your influences as an undergrad, and how did that like just flip? You completely flipped into doing these beautiful forms and being physical. It's just a whole different thing.
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking about that a lot today with some of the BFA students who I visited this morning, but it was sort of this, while I was here in school, I was working in this way that was just totally just going wild, experimenting, like playing around, just making messes, not thinking about any sort of repercussions of the real world or anything. And then graduating, it was this like harsh shock of reality where I was moved in with my parents, had no studio, needed to get a job, and just had to like completely change the way I thought about making work. And for me, it was, okay, I got a job at a wood shop. There's scraps of wood everywhere that I can use. I'm just gonna make little objects. And then honestly thinking about it, like, okay, I'm gonna make a little object that for the first time ever I thought, like, I'm gonna try to sell it, see if someone will buy it, and then I can make a little money, maybe buy a new carving tool. And it was just like, seems so foreign to think of like that, here in art school, but it was just like thinking in this way that is in some ways horrible that we have to live like that. But it was also, I found it, I think, kind of freeing and liberating. There was no longer this pressure of the sort of academic art world, sort of that cerebral sort of like weight. It was just more raw, just like, okay, I'm making something with any way I can, try to sell it, try to make something else, sell that if I can or not, or see if I can get some free, working like that, I think opened me up to making in this new way that kind of led me to where I am. But yeah, I could talk about it forever. Oh, yeah, I think that was also very interesting because while I was here, it was very much like contemporary installation artists that were sort of guiding me. And then when I graduated and got more into like the craft and woodworking world, there were more like modernist artists and people like Noguchi or J.B. Blunk, who I hadn't really considered as much while I was here. That was much more material based. But to be honest, it was less like thinking about specific artists or designers that had kind of guided me, and it was more the ways of thinking and making, the sort of kind of cerebral art school mixed with the working in a furniture shop with a bunch of guys who didn't really care about art and were just more into like just cool wood techniques and stuff. And so that kind of, I used those kind of influences to kind of guide me a little bit.
Thanks for the talk.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to know, being an Oregon-based artist, if like the ice storms and wildfires, that changed your relationship to wood at all?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, moving to Oregon, because I grew up in San Francisco in the city, and then I went to school here, and then I moved back to San Francisco, and then 5 years ago moved back out into the country where I live now. And yeah, I mean, it's completely changed how I thought about wood. When I was in San Francisco, it was just like going to the lumber store and buying like walnut or maple. Very much like I would just copy what I would do with the furniture maker who I worked for. We'd go to lumber store and buy boards of maple and walnut. That's what I would do, carve spoons out of it. But coming up here, it just became much more of a, just like seeing the world around me as like potential and possibility. and working with what I have. For instance, the ice storm, the property where I live, we got like 30 trees fell down, just insane, huge fir trees and ash trees. And so now I'm just like, okay, the next few years of my life, I'm going to be carving this wood, which is just a completely different way of thinking. And you can definitely trace it in my work, you know, for better, for worse. Some of my earlier work had this very muted wood with very muted grain. Like I really avoided like highly figured wood or wood with like crazy trippy grain. I was like turned off by that as like hokey studio furniture stuff. You know, I wanted just like minimal white maple, which sometimes I think was a very beautiful way of working. But then moving here, I don't know, something about moving into rural Oregon and being super into like crazy wood. I got very obsessed with the beauty and complexity of wood, and like I was talking about the decay and the rot and all of that. And so sometimes I have to catch myself where I'm getting too wrapped up in like the beautiful grain, and so I don't turn into one of these, you know, I don't know. I try to not become like a hippie wood carver, just like doing crazy like trippy things out of burls and stuff. It's always like a temptation for me to go down that route. So, but yeah, it's just a sort of another kind of influence there. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about the tension between, you know, strictly sculptural work and then more functional work, like the lamps, candelabras, and
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what introducing function feels like for you, and
Yeah.
what that's like, and maybe things that are lost or gained? Or
Yeah. Yeah, for me, you know, I think I love thinking about functionality and interactivity in this very sort of like poetic, whimsical way. And there's a lot of room for that to become, you know, a beautiful way to work with furniture and stuff. But I do find, and I'm still learning this myself, like there's a point where my particular way of working, with those lamps, for instance, like there's no room for, you know, poetic whimsy when you have to like wire a socket like in a functional lamp that's going in someone's house. Like I really struggle with that. But I love the idea of, for instance, the candelabra, you know, the idea of like lighting candles in like a forest, you know, and the branches. That's kind of what I was thinking of with that. And that is this very clear way of translating something that is this, could just be this abstract idea that sits in a gallery into your dining room with your family, like lighting these candles on these branches, and that becomes a functional object. But yeah, I think it's just everyone is different, and you have to kind of recognize sort of the way that you can deal with things like functionality or not. Like Amanda has always mentioned is that I was a product design student when I first started taking sculpture classes. I tried product design, and I just couldn't do it. I was like, there was always a part of my mind that was just like, I don't care about the way a toothbrush feels in your hand, like unless I'm making like a really long tooth, you know, just or something. But I do feel like product design, there is like, you know, there is so much room for exploring those conceptual ideas, and it can be such a amazing way to work too. So I don't know. Yeah, I could also ramble about that for a long time. Yeah. Oh.
Do you have any book recommendations?
Book recommendations. Yeah. Oh man, this is where I get stressed out because I've been so far out of the academic world for so long that let's see. I'm sure you know, I do read and I listen to a lot. I do read. Okay, guys, I promise. I listen to a lot of audiobooks when I'm working. Let's see, a lot of books about like nature is really like I don't read a lot of books about art making or design or anything like that. But books that have really influenced me, a lot of them are about like Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. I don't know if anybody's ever read that. It's just a beautiful book that when I was at a chair making class at Penland craft school, somebody recommended, and I read it there, and it was just like, just thinking about the natural world. Robert McFarlane books I've been reading a lot lately, and then So one thing that changed my life also from sculpture class was the On Longing. I don't know if you guys still teach that book, but On Longing, I forget who it's by. Susan Stewart, yeah, chapter of it, The Grotesque Body. That's a beautiful text about, the body and the grotesque, but yeah. Yeah.
Do you still make everything by hand? And if so, how do you care for your hands when you're using them so much?
Yeah, that's a serious thing that I'm deal with a lot. Yeah, I pretty much do everything by hand except, of course, these. This project was like 2 weeks or so of me carving, and then 3 years of me just like emailing and stressing out. But for the most part, it's mostly me. I've had every now and then some help in the studio. Right now I have like a 16-year-old kid from kind of country Oregon, high schooler, that comes and helps me sand. But for the most part, yeah, it's just an intense amount of sanding, especially those smaller pieces that just kind of have to be hand sanded. I try to use, I use a lot of like power tools and grinders and orbital sanders and stuff, but yeah, it's hands really brutal on the hands, and my hands get a lot of numbness, tingling, pains. It's tough. I try to stretch, and I try to keep having different processes happening at once. Like the hand carving texture is very different than like an orbital sander, which is very different than hand sanding. So I try to do that, and I feel like I need to get more help too, because I spend a lot of time just like orbital sanding a huge blob for just days, when I feel like I could do it, but that's a big thing that I struggle with a lot. All right, I don't see anybody else, I don't think. Yeah, well, okay, thank you so much, yeah.